All right, welcome to the second part. Last week, we just covered a little bit about the basics of what are corals, and we'll now get into a little bit more about life on the reef and what is going on. But I do want to just get everybody grounded that corals are animals. They're two layers of skin with the membrane in them, sort of like a jellyfish, so soft, gooey texture on the inside. They also have a layer of mucus on them. For hard corals that we often talk about, it's like 1 to 2 millimeters. Softer corals, it can be up to 6 or 7. They treat that like the skin, that helps protect them from infections from viruses or pathogens coming in. It's the same as ours. If you get a cut, you open a wound that you could possibly get some infection. One of the ways they eat, they have the tentacles that open up. You'll see the picture, and especially at night, because they'll bring in plankton. They're little stingers and suck in plankton. But 90% of their nutrition comes from an algae that lives inside of them called zooxanthellae. And this relationship is ones that the two, between the corals and the zooxanthellae, they live and support each other. The zooxanthellae uses photosynthesis to make carbohydrates, which the corals need. And then when we talk corals, usually we talk about hard ones that make a limestone skeleton, and that'll be the focus more of types of corals when we talk about that during webinars, or softer corals. So just a little bit about backgrounds and some of the aspects of corals that really play into effect when we talk about destruction of reefs. For those that have dived and you've seen, been on a reef and you've seen the various kind of species of fish, and it's important to the life and the maintenance of that ecosystem that there are a lot of numbers, because if one of them goes away, gets eaten, or I'll talk about some disease things, the nature of the ecosystem of the reefs are so fragile that they have to have these redundant species to back each other up to allow them to adapt and sustain themselves if something happens. Using the analogy of like the house of cards, or that game Genja, that you pull one too many things out and it comes crashing down. And that's what it is with life on the reef, that if you lose too many species, or something happens to the coral themselves, the reef will die, and then we lose the contributions that we as humans get, but also the beauty that we see when we dive. Two examples are parrotfish that we see a lot. They chew and eat the algae off of corals when algae gets too prevalent, so it's part of maintaining the reef. But they're also an easy one for the locals, residents, to fish for, because they're not too deep. They're decent sized fish, but not really big. But down in the Caribbean, they got overfished, and which left the other main algae eating animal to be the long spine eating sea urchins. Don't see much of those anymore, because in the early 80s, a disease came through, pretty much wiped out the population of the long spine sea urchins. And when you lose the two animals, the two species that kept the algae under control, they really started seeing a lot of algae growth and damage to the reefs because of that. And again, that is just two examples of why we want to have these multiple species, and why every fish matters, and the importance of that biodiversity and the multiple species on a reef. I think we've all seen pictures, or been in the oceans, that there's not a lot of food sources in there, unlike fresh water that's moving through over something that it's always getting nutrients from the land around it. In the ocean, you don't have that. So one of the interesting features of the reef is that it is a highly efficient recycling system. The fish that eat the algae, they falls down. There are bottom eaters that dwell and eat the waste. They're food for other ones. As the fish eat, they grow. Then you have the predator fish, the carnivores that eat the other fish. Again, they poop, and it's a cycle that we'll see on the next page of this food system, and it's a food chain within a reef. You know, we're used to hearing about food chains with animals, and this is the reef has a food chain on how it can produce the nutrients. But the thing is even though it produces a lot of nutrients, there's not a lot of excess. You know, that produces, but they consume. So that's again another reason it's important that they maintain the number of fish on the reef, the types of fish on the reef, because they are all interwoven in this spider web of dependability, survivability, that when an out of balance occurs, something starts to go wrong with the reef. Let me see if this is going to let me. So again, this is just a pictorial I was talking about on sort of the food chain, where you have the things that we see on the reefs, the corals that have the zooxanthellae in them. You see seaweeds and other type of algae there, and they're food for animals. I'll talk in a minute about the type of fish, some of the types of fish that might eat the algae and actually sometimes eat the corals as well. Crabs, sea stars, a variety of things feed off the corals, and other fish eat off the corals, eat the algae and things, and then depending on the size of the fish, there's a bigger fish in the ocean and they get eaten, ultimately up to the sharks. You know, we don't see routinely huge fish, huge mammals and things on the reefs. We see the sharks are usually the apex of the food chain. And that's why there's a lot of attention the past 5 to 10 years on shark conservation. We're not going to talk a lot about that other than just right now. But again, if you lose the sharks, they're the predators that keep fish under them control. Then you have this mid-level set of fish that get out of balance and consume all the younger ones, all the smaller ones that then just disrupt, again, the fragile nature of life on the reefs. And all the species of that live on the reef are important to the survivability of reefs. And even with that, just around themselves, corals crowd each other out. We don't see them anymore, but when you have the elkhorn and staghorn, the branching corals that grow faster, they'll start crowding up into the bigger boulder corals or some other things, but they have defensive mechanisms, stingers and toxins. When you have dead corals, you get algae growing in there, you get sponges, you have other things that are starting to fill up that space. And again, when you have the different species coming in, it disrupts the balance, but also we talked a little bit last week, but the importance of sunlight for the zooxanthellae, for their photosynthesis. They get crowding each other out because of the lack of sunlight as well. So having the room to grow, and that's an important factor when people are doing nurseries and outplantings, is to make sure they plant corals on reefs and give them room to grow so that they don't outgrow each other. And somewhere I've yet to find it, somebody had a YouTube video of actually corals battling each other with the polyps and the tentacles, but I haven't found that. I'm still looking for it, but you know, they do need space to grow, and they try to make it where they can. Fish on the reef, this isn't fish ID, but some of the fish that we see a lot are important. Herbivores, they don't make up a lot of species, but we do see a lot of them based on the population of the fish. And again, they're eating plants. Plants need sunlight. We dive mostly on the shallower reefs where the plants are going to be, the algae is going to be, so the herbivores aren't going to be there. You know, the big things, two of the big fish that eat them are the parrotfish and damselfish that you see here. And I think we've all seen parrotfish before. Hear them with those beaks, you can hear them crunching. And it was when I started learning more about coral and learning about these aspects of understanding when people say that when you're diving, you can hear a reef. If it's quiet enough, it's got a sound of its own. And there's a lot of going on with the various animals that are in there, fish are feeding. And occasionally when we see corals or sponges and things, we might see damage where the parrotfish might have eaten into the coral a little bit, but that usually is not, that doesn't damage it enough to affect the colony. It's just an over-aggressive parrotfish. Now, the couple of times it is if they do have food supply issues, and you might have 6 or 8 parrotfish, but usually you don't see parrotfish schools right around the colony. You'll see one fish eating, and then it moves on. And again, they're shallower because of the plants that they feed off of and needing the sunlight. The other one are the carnivores, the fish that we eat. We see a lot of the barracudas, we see the sharks, we see groupers. And again, they're just as necessary as well, because these carnivores keep the other ones in check, and within fish species, the shark in the apex of that, when they want to eat fish, it's just, the more I've learned, it's just a very complex system, and the survivability of the reef depends on every species. So when you understand and hear some of the islands in the Caribbean or over in the Pacific setting up management areas, marine management areas, and no fish limits, and the attention down in the Keys over the fall and spring about wanting to change the rule for expanding the no fish zones there at the Florida Reef tract down there. It's because they need to make sure survivability of all the species, because they do play this important role. There are predators in there that are non-human induced. The top one is a lionfish. We see a lot of those. It is not, was not native here to the Caribbean and Atlantic. It comes out of the Indo-Pacific. A lot of speculation on how it got introduced in here. Pretty fish, but the spines are dangerous. But why they are not liked from a reef perspective is they will eat any small fish that can fit in their mouth, and they eat a lot. So they can really play havoc on a reef with the destruction of the smaller fish that you need to be able to grow. But also, they lay a lot of eggs very fast, so they can really, population explosion can happen quickly. And that's, I think, probably the reason why most of the Caribbean countries, and I know Florida, you can hunt those. There's no permitting needed, no limit. They know it's an invasive species that is damaging the reef and their livelihood, whether it was from fishing or tourism. So they're more than happy to get rid of the lionfish. They're good for 2 things in my mind. Tacos, which I had, Lawrence would talk about the Caymans. First time I had lionfish tacos was there at Grand Cayman. And then ceviche, and I had that down there as well. The second predator that we hear a lot from diving is the crown of thorns. It's a sea star. It's not found in the Atlantic at all. Again, native to the Indo-Pacific, but it has been seen in the Red Sea. And hopefully this video, we're going to play about 1.5 minutes or so of video to tell you a little bit about crown of thorns.
Coral is normally difficult for large organisms to consume. Crown of thorns starfish. This echinoderm feeds exclusively on live coral polyps by everting its stomach through its mouth and spreading it over coral tissue. Digestive enzymes are then released that liquefy the coral for easy consumption. After feeding, only the limestone skeleton of the coral remains. The crown of thorns starfish is an invasive species to some reefs, possibly because of exploitation of its predators, like the giant triton, by humans. In the absence of predators, these sea stars can multiply and destroy entire coral colonies within months. Crown of thorns starfish are able to move around with the use of their hundreds of tiny tube feet.
So a little bit about that, and again, how we as humans can contribute unknowingly to the demise of reefs. that the triton sea snail can grow up to 18 inches long. So the shell is really a treasure looked at for jewelry making and other things. One of these crown of thorns can destroy over 100 square feet of coral in a year, and then a female can lay millions of eggs. So again, very populous, just like lionfish, very venomous, not easy to kill. They're still trying to figure out easy ways to do that. But just again, another invasive species that we contribute to, or at least unknowingly contribute to the spread. The crown of thorns is, sometimes people consider it to actually be an asset, because when there's just a couple spread out over an area, because they do eat the faster growing coral, it helps keep the growth of coral in check. But very quickly, as you heard me say, because of the number of eggs, they could get out of control. They don't have predators, and then it affects the health of the reef. Two supporting ecosystems that I really hadn't thought a lot about, again, until I started looking at this, even though I'd seen lots of them, are the mangroves. If you've been down south, either in Florida or the Caribbean, you've seen mangroves there growing in the salt water. And they do a lot of things to benefit the coral and the reefs. One is they trap sediment. Sediment washing out murkies up the water, blocks the sunlight, prevents photosynthesis. But also the root system, as you see up here, is a great place for juvenile fish to live. If they get hatched up here or somewhere else, they can come live until they get too big and grow out. So it's a nursery. It's a great place for the fish to grow. And I remember probably one of my first times of seeing some of the reef fish were in the Virgin Islands. We went canoeing in the mangrove swamp, but we had masks, so we went snorkeling around there. So just interesting, if you ever have a chance to snorkel around mangroves, to consider doing that, just to see what's going on. The second thing is seagrass beds. We see them occasionally when we're diving. Often turtles might be in there, but likewise, they'll filter out sediment and hold sediment down. Some of the fish that might live on the reef during the daytime, they come feed on the grass at night. You get a different type of nutrient from the grass. Then when they go back to the reefs later on, poop, different nutrients get added into the Reefs that other bottom dwellers eat and live off of. So things to remember. And just pictures of the mangroves. So it's down at Key Largo, and a picture really of just showing the shallows and the roots and how they can give a better idea of how they might help filter out sediment, washing off from the shore, and what about that the next 2 weeks. So that was it. Wanting to keep these really short and focused on this one being related to life on the reef, the relationship of different animals, and the diversity on the reef, and why that diversity is important. So question, something for anybody that's either any of y'all on learned something new that you wanted to go ahead and key your mic and say something.
I'll just go ahead and say, Tim, for me, it's kind of interesting with the crown of thorns and the problem they represent to coral reefs. I'm thankful we don't have that in the Atlantic basin, but it's kind of interesting the way you described. They turn their stomachs inside out, and they inject enzymes to dissolve the soft tissue of the coral. Sean just asked, and Sean, you're welcome to ask yourself. Can you see it, Tim?
Yeah. Now that I'm not screen sharing. So following up on the crown of thorns, Lawrence, when my sister, I first heard about crown of thorns when they're going to the Red Sea, and they had just started seeing crown of thorns in the Red Sea, and speculation there, don't know how, that they had attached themselves to a boat, whether it was in a water bilge tank or something. And when they purged or somehow, that was a boat transferred them somehow from the Indo-Pacific into the Red Sea. Don't know how they proved that, but that was what they were hearing. So shown on the sea urchins, it was a disease. That in the early 80s, they still don't know the source of, they know the pathogen, but they don't know how it got there. And it just really targeted that population. I had seen some reports, and even reporting in 83, you can't depend on everything. But some people speculated that it was a tank, some boat, large vessel, dumped their waste tanks, and that introduced this pathogen, this bacteria, into the Caribbean basin, and it just spread. Human contribution to bacteria that destroys corals is, is noted in the Keys. They had flagged a pathogen that was bacteria that was coming out of the poorly functional cesspools, the septic systems out of the houses there. And then they finally got building a couple central waste treatment plants in the Keys that solved that problem. So again, that was a couple reports speculating on that, but it was some bacteria that pretty much wiped them out. What's interesting, I don't know if it's Moat Marine Lab or if it was the Florida Aquarium. One of those places is starting to try to introduce sea urchins back. They're trying to grow them and then introduce them back into the wild per se, because they are a necessary of the reef system, because they do eat the algae. Don't want to step on them, but they do help the reefs by keeping algae in check.
Yeah, I remember, diving back in the 80s, and they were like everywhere. And you always had to worry about, not putting your hand on a sea urchin or something like that. And now, I didn't realize, I just thought, well, maybe where we're diving, they don't have as many sea urchins. So I just didn't realize until you were talking about that their population has diminished.
You see them, you see them somewhere, but it's like the branching corals, the elkhorn staghorn corals. They got wiped out by diseases, but that doesn't mean 100% eradication. You see them here and there, not a lot of them. And again, just the diseases wiped out the corals. A bacteria took care of the sea urchins, and now they're trying to undo both of those. So it's interesting that the sea urchins are being looked at as well.